Hello, welcome back to the Thinking Channels. Of course, a Thursday lunchtime, no game to be previewing this week, but of course we had quite a big event in Norwich City's yearly, calendar in terms of last night, the AGM, the first one without Delia and Michael in almost 30 years. So quite an iconic moment in terms of Norwich City history. We're of course live this lunchtime to maybe give you a little bit of reaction, a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of those topics that were discussed. We'll also speak a little bit around the interview that's now on our channels. You can obviously go and watch that after you've watched this live on YouTube. It's on our audio platforms with Mark Attanasio. I think lots there to be positive about for the future of this football club. Adam Harvey joined by Paddy, Davitt and Seaman to discuss it all. Paddy, I think probably to start with, I just want to maybe get your overall assessment, your overall feeling and overriding emotions as you walked out of that AGM meeting last night. I mean, lots of different topics, which of course we'll delve into in a little bit more of a deeper dive in a moment, but just an overall overriding emotion. And how did you feel walking out?
Well, yeah, and let's separate out the results at the moment on the pitch, which aren't positive, but we know the reasons why. And to be fair, Mark, when we spoke to him in the post, he talked about that and kind of drawing a parallel with his long association with the Brewers. You're never quite as good in the good spells and you're never quite as bad and that's kind of where we are at the moment, I think. But parking that in terms of how did I feel the mood in the room, very positive. Optimistic, I think, is probably the key word, because there is quite clearly somebody who's obviously not acting alone. He's the embodiment of, there's other people around him. Richard Resler, his longtime friend and business partner, and his family as well. Mike Attanasio was there again in person. And so it isn't just, but he's kind of the figurehead of this. He's almost the front person for what feels like this changing of the guard. And that's now gone through to all intents and purposes. Obviously, there's this March the 1st date where it's kind of rubber stamped. But, Delia and Michael were not there last night, as you said, Adam. First time ever in the last 28 years, no longer on the board. So in that terms of official capacity, that was a very big moment, I think, in terms of the visuals and the optics. But what is clear is that, the baton has been passed to, I think, somebody. Again, just to reiterate, when we talk about Mark Attanasio, we're talking about him and Norfolk Holdings, but an entity who clearly have the financial wherewithal. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and we'll get into it in more depth in terms of the finances, particularly with the upcoming January transfer window. But, whereas previously the finances were always front and centre and limiting maybe the room for manoeuvre, certainly when they got into the Premier League and those two failed attempts at staying there, that doesn't feel the case. And that isn't obviously me saying that they can now go out and spend 15, 20, 30 million pounds on players, because that isn't what the strategy is. And that's not what Ben Napper's about. It's not what Johannes Torup is about, or Mark Attanasio for that point, if you look at his work with the Brewers over 20 odd years. So, it isn't a charter to go and spend money like it's going out of fashion, but there's no doubt that Norwich are now in a very different financial landscape in terms of the backstop they've got to enable them to maybe make more football-focused decisions when it comes to player trading. It isn't going to be, we need to keep the wolf from the door, as it has been in seasons past and certain windows past. That era is gone. This is a new era. Still lots of challenges, still trying to scramble out of a championship, which gets more competitive by the season. But, in Mark Attanasio, they've got somebody there who I think, is, as he said himself, if Norwich aren't back in the Premier League in these next 5 years, in his words, he feels he would have failed. So if I'm a Norwich fan, I just hang my hat on that there is a guy who is committed and will do what it takes, whether it's financial support or supporting the likes of Ben Napper, Johannes, the executive team, to get Norwich back into the Premier League. And if I'm a Norwich fan, obviously we know the Premier League isn't always what it's all cracked up to be in the last two attempts, but you just feel this time around it would be different because, as I've spoken about there, they have the infrastructure in place now where they could have a real good go at trying to not just get up. That's the first part. And they've done that twice before. But crucially, the difference being this time, can they stay up? Can they do it differently? So, I'll throw that back to you two lads. But for me, I walked out of that AGM and then, after we'd spoken to Mark subsequently and feeling, this is a club in very safe hands.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, particularly given maybe mine and Sam's allegiances as Norwich fans previous to this job, I think given kind of the situation even that we're in now, I still feel you came out of that meeting with ultra positivity, kind of the forward projections of the club. I mean, even when you hear sort of the plans they have for the club moving forwards, trying to stabilise in the Premier League. I mean, in the past, no disrespect to Delia and Michael, they just didn't have the financial power for Norwich to compete in the Premier League ultimately, and that's ultimately where they kind of fell short in recent times. It feels like now, even though maybe they're not going to suddenly spend £20 million on a striker, there is going to be that reinvestment of this money that maybe goes out for player sales will be put back into the squad. And I think that, breeds confidence. And maybe you look at the models of Brighton and Brentford, and they have kind of done a similar thing where they've, put money, sold players, put the money back in, and gradually as they've increased the player sales, they've managed to increase the money they can put into buying players. And I think that's, pretty positive for the future. I mean, Sam, would you kind of agree with Paddy's assessment in general and coming out of that meeting feeling pretty positive?
Yeah, I think the money thing was probably what I took most from it. As crass as that sounds, I think you went away feeling like, yeah, actually Norwich do have the sort of potential for investment that a lot of people hoped they would when Attanasio and Norfolk Holdings first came through the door. And obviously they've got those PNS rules that mean they probably can't spend loads and loads, and they won't spend willy-nilly on players who they aren't absolutely sure are key to their strategy and fit with everything else they want to do. But I think what was really interesting that Attanasio said yesterday was that maybe early in his career, he saw players as investments a little bit too much. Now he sees them as assets. But I think still that knowledge as somebody who's obviously had successful businesses in the past and works with money, I think is a really valuable one for Norwich, because you speak to people inside the club and you listen to what they say publicly, and it feels like the view is Ben Napper presents an idea to Attanasio as an investment, and if Attanasio feels it's a valuable one for Norwich and it's one that will profit for them in the future, then he's happy to trust Ben Napper and give him that money. He obviously won't do anything that he doesn't believe in, and he does delegate well to people who know things better. He isn't someone who's just going to come in and say, I'm the owner and this is my passion project and I'm going to spend 100 million on players who I think look pretty decent. He actually evaluates it from an investment perspective. And when you're a club like Norwich, who's trying to operate a trading model of players coming in and then selling them for more, and eventually, that process being upgraded and scaled up to the point where Norwich are not buying players for 5 million and selling them for 20, but buying them for 20 and selling them for 100, as now Brighton are in a position to do, and probably Brentford in the next few years. It feels like with that strategy, Attanasio is very much aligned. And actually that was one of the themes that I felt coming out of that was alignment. And in a way, it's quite funny that Attanasio came in before the Ben Napper era and Johannes Torp arriving. And I suppose that's where his influence can be felt, because it feels like we've talked about alignment quite a lot in terms of what Napper wants and how that works with Torp and the players. But equally, I'd now put Attanasio in that bracket as well in terms of the data and the way that he wants things to be done. It feels like it is all very aligned and going in the same direction. And as we've seen at Norwich previously, when they've been successful, that usually is a recipe for getting back to the Premier League. So yeah, obviously the struggles on the pitch at the moment that Paddy mentioned maybe aren't making it feel like the most positive place at the moment, but that to me felt like a real good step in the right direction in the long term. And it feels like, yeah, they are in the right hands.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the alignment between maybe the sort of four key pillars of his baseball team and Norwich City in terms of fan experience, competitive team. He mentioned those all again last night. It feels like there's certainly an alignment there. Paddy, just before we maybe delve into some of the questions, I'm just intrigued to get your thoughts on him as an individual, his personality. Of course, you met him for the first time last night. Me and Sam did meet him briefly last year, of course, with after last year's AGM. But just in terms of his nature and sort of personable skills, what did you make of him as an individual? Humble, patience, obviously a key word. Everything you maybe sort of see and read came to life when you met him in person.
Well, it was very interesting. Yeah, I mean, you probably do have a perception of somebody who has been as successful as he has as a businessman. I mean, he's founded or co-founded a company that, asset management, 40 billion plus worth of assets. This is a serious, successful businessman who is obviously at the Brewers as well, purely in a sporting sort of focus. He's over 2 decades or so. He's turned them into serial sort of playoff contenders against far bigger rivals in terms of teams they face in the Major League Baseball with bigger financial backing. So very astute, and you have all these preconceptions. But on a personal level, you walk away there and having spent whatever we did in the end, it was probably thick end of an hour in his company, and Mike as well, his son. No ego at all. There's nothing. You would not have deduced that this is somebody who was as successful as he has been in his business life, and because there wasn't that force of personality, there wasn't that bombast or kind of trying to force his opinions onto the room, whatever. It was very much the opposite, and that chimes, I think, with what we've discussed already here, which is for me, he looks like he's coming into Norwich with the mindset of he wants to be a facilitator. He wants to create the conditions. Of course, he's got the financial resources to back that, but he actually wants to put people in positions that he feels are capable, whether that's on the business side of the club, as he said, or the sporting side, maybe with Ben at the apex of that, and then Johannes and all the other guys who've been brought in. But really, trust these people, trust their judgment. I put you in these positions because I believe that you are the right person. Go on and prove that to be the case. And that takes quite a lot of confidence, really, I guess, in any walk of life, that you don't really want to impose yourself or micromanage to that degree. So, my initial impression, just on a human level, was a very impressive individual. And, but when he speaks, you can tell, it's particularly around the financial elements of when he's discussing, where Norwich are as a club now, what they're trying to do within English football, what they're trying to achieve. He's clearly very astute, and he understands, I think, increasingly the sort of football landscape, which he said, up to this point, he didn't really know. He was being parachuted into English football. And even that mindset, how often did we hear, look, I don't know everything about this, far from it. I need to listen. I need to learn. I need to immerse myself in it. And I just think that probably is a window into his character, that, he doesn't think he's the smartest person in the room necessarily, but, what he is good at is clearly taking advice, listening to the people who do know probably more than he does in certain areas of whether it's football or business, probably. And because, even in the business element, he talked about Richard Resler, who's come in now, and his background being in real estate, and how he will almost, you got the sense, will lead on the sort of Cara Road project, improving the matchday experience, maybe longer term, what Cara Road looks like in terms of expanding the ground, the footfall around it, all those commercial opportunities. But it's going to be Richard Resler. You get the sense. We heard at the AGM formal part of the meeting that he was at the game on Saturday just gone, the Bristol game. He was here 2 or 3 days around that, meeting people inside the club, getting a sense of what the capacity or what the potential is for the stadium moving forward. And he will very much lead on that, was my take on it. And again, that's just another example that I think what you have in Attanasio is somebody who wants to set the tone, set the cultures, but not necessarily lead that or at least want to lead others. It's very much, no, I'll create the environment, you now step up and I'll back you to the hilt. And together, collectively, if we're all on the same page, then you hope that Norwich can get to where they want to get to on his watch.
You do indeed. We'll sort of now take it into the meeting and maybe sort of delve into individual topics. But before we talk about maybe the more topical one, Sam, obviously, naturally with AGMs, you kind of get the light-hearted questions around Wi-Fi and kiosks within the stadium, weddings, supporter parties, floodlights. Any particular highlights from sort of that array of questions?
I liked the one about the free gift for members, which I think kicked off a little bit on social media a couple of months ago, and it was quite fun hearing people try and work out what that was. Once again, it sounds like the club feel they were let down by suppliers in that sense, but I think that got actually quite a large round of applause. In line with sort of the CSF and Delia and Michael. It was up there with the reception. So I think there were a good few questions that you could take out of that one as sort of typical AGM ones, as you mentioned, the kiosk one about the shutters being down before the end of half time. I agree, absolute travesty. Give the people what they want. But no, there are a few of that nature, and I think it's always interesting to to hear about what fans are generally concerned about, because I think in our heads and in terms of what you... My mic's gone there. I think I'm back. Yeah, usually in our head and in headlines, it's sort of transfers and what's going on the pitch. But for a lot of people, their main concern is, how they can buy a program and what their match day looks like. So yeah, it's always interesting, always a reminder that maybe the football isn't absolutely everything in the world of Norwich City. But yeah, definitely a few that you could highlight as typical AGM questions, I thought.
Yeah, moving it back to football. I mean, just before we sort of talk about that, just worth noting they did make some touching tributes to Terry Alcock and Craig Shakespeare, of course, who we've lost in the last year. So that was a nice moment to sort of remember those two individuals who, served this football club very well. Paddy, I suppose January transfer window is maybe the place to start, because I can already see some people maybe making questions around it. We've spoken a little bit about finances already. I mean, DRG here on YouTube saying Mark speaks so well. I do worry that he's now mentioned that there's money to spend, that fans will have an unrealistic view on transfers, especially when nobody gets signed. I think obviously there's also been questions here or from Andy saying I think lessons have been learnt from past windows. Naismith springs to mind, but I think with the structure in place, we can potentially get more value for money in January. I mean, on January, what did you kind of get from the messaging that was portrayed from Ben Napper, Mark Attanasio in terms of the finances available, and also do you think they will delve into that market when it comes to January?
Well, before I sort of went down to Carrow Road last night, because me and Sam did our sort of regular subscriber Q&A on Monday lunchtime, and obviously, particularly off the back of the injury situation, particularly off the situation with Josh Sargent, and maybe not feeling there's somebody who's stepped up at the moment. What would they look to do in January? And at that point, I'm still thinking, well, Johannes ruled out free agents, didn't he? Specifically in terms of strikers after Saturday's game and looking at that area. But you just felt, well, I'll have to do something in that area, really, because I don't think it's been graphically illustrated now. Without Josh Sargent, they do seem to be in trouble in terms of the top end of the pitch. But I was kind of leaning towards maybe look at the loan route again. Of course, if you go back to last January, that's sort of what in the end what they did. And as Mark touched on last night, Sidney Van Hooydonk wasn't a signing that will live on too long in terms of his impact on the pitch anyway. So, but maybe look at that again. But having listened to both him and Ben last evening, I think it feels like that if the right targets are there, then as we've discussed, then they would look to move on them with a couple of caveats. I mean, it was very clear. Ben Napper again said, and Sam's touched on this word alignment. There won't be a quick fix. It won't be panic mode. We need to go and buy somebody in January now. It'll only be players coming in if it again chimes with that mid to longer term time scale, the strategy. And Mark, I thought there was quite a revealing line in the post sort of meeting stuff when we sat down with him, where he talked kind of thing. Well, he's obviously not going to put names in, but he said Ben had sort of identified 2 targets, is what he actually put a number on it. And he said, look, you can join the dots. You only have to look at what type of player in terms of profile they went for in the summer, in terms of the youth, that potential to upgrade their performances. And then as a result, maybe their transfer value, which again, we've touched on already in this debate, rather than positionally. I mean, we can all probably look at the areas of the squad where they need to do something more so than others in terms of the positions. But just in terms of the type of signing, it chimes for me. January is going to be more like the summer, so that's more sort of Thorson, more Schwartau, those type of project players that might not be ready necessarily in the here and now, but ultimately that's not what this is about now. This is about bringing in material that they can work with and develop, and Johannes can do what he needs to do on the coaching pitches, and then they can from there develop and evolve and go on to fulfill that kind of raw material that they're going to be brought in initially. So, yeah, I mean, both were clear, both that there are funds available. I mean, it was interesting, Mark and Mike had mapped out, they'd had quite prolonged meetings with Neil Adams, with Ben Napper, that, then they had a board meeting yesterday. Ben Napper did an hour presentation. You would have thought maybe January would have been quite a key part of that presentation. And the message was very clear from Mark Attanasio, there are funds available. But as I say, I think within for me, the parameters of players who they feel will come in and again could add to what they're trying to do moving forward. I don't think we're going to be, again, to reiterate, going into January's market and looking to play 5, 10, 20 million pounds for players. The only other thing he did add a little bit on those 2 targets is that there are a lot of other clubs looking at these players. So, make of that what you will, whether that's domestic rivals or further abroad. But that's the reality. I mean, Ben himself spoke about January as a reactive market. More often than not, you're trying to react to, and you could see that with Norwich, we're reacting to maybe the situation they find themselves in. I don't think they will fall into that trap. I think it will be very much, maybe Ben has identified 2 players, but if they can't do those deals, then those deals won't get done. But it won't be for a lack of finance. I don't think necessarily. It will just be in the here and now. Can they bring them in, and do they sort of align with what they're trying to do, which is the broader strategy? I mean, as Mark said, Johannes doesn't, and Johannes said this as well last week, he doesn't want 35 players. He doesn't want to have that many options. He wants a reasonable squad. Not all of them may be championship ready in the here and now. And I think we've seen that in this run without McLean, without Nunes, without Sargent, without Gunn. But he certainly doesn't want that inflated or bloated style of squad. So that would also underline they're not going to go big in January, be it in terms of headcount or in terms of finance. But money is there. Ben Knapp has identified 2 targets, and we'll see how we move along. I mean, it's still 6 weeks or so before they actually need to do anything tangible in that. And as Ben made it quite clear in the formal business, by then, hopefully, subject to no further injuries, all the current lads who are unavailable, including Josh Sargent, will be back, will be available. So, it's now ideally you'd like to do something. They're not able to do that unless, and Johannes has ruled it out, the free agents. So by the time January swings round, if you've got Sargent back, you've got McLean, you've got Nunes, you've got Gunn, and you've had a fair wind with any other further injury issues, that will probably dial down the need to actually go and do something, because as we've seen, when those players are available, they're more than a match for any team in the Championship this season.
Yeah, staying on the theme of January, one player that maybe Norwich fans would have feared they'd be losing, Boa Signs. Of course, we've all watched him so far this season and just how brilliant he's been. Top goal scorer in the Championship, one of the top creators more generally in terms of his goal and assist contributions. It's almost unbelievable and almost scary how good he's been. There was a question from the floor around his contractual situation, and Ben Napper outlined that they're speaking to his representatives. It's something that the club are willing to try and extend. And of course, we all know why, in terms of even if Norwich do eventually have to go on to sell him, which of course is inevitable in this game. Hopefully they can obviously maximise the fee that they can get for him. Still a relatively young man, and of course flourishing at the moment. But Sam, more importantly, I mean, Mark Attanasio, even in the post-match sort of interview part we sort of had with him, I suppose, if you want to call it that, outlined that he's not an individual that they're willing or looking to try and sell in January. Just going to play that clip now, and then we'll delve into it a little bit more.
What about the other side of that? Ben was asked in the shareholder meeting about Borja Sainz, who is red hot at the moment, and you wouldn't be surprised if there was interest in January. In years past, and not all that long ago, maybe decisions would have had to be made in terms of player sales based on the finances, or lack of, rather than football decisions. That's very much not how it's going to be on your watch.
No, we can control what we can control, so we don't need to sell Borja in January. And I frankly, we don't need to sell him ever. It's just at some point there's an element of fairness, if I understand the ecosystem, where if you're getting paid a very full price, it doesn't have to be an extreme price, and it's something that someone wants to do, and they've been, Borja's been great for us, right? He does everything. He runs for 90 minutes. By the way, today I went in and I met everybody who's in the executive, even down to the assistants, and for the player, there's a chart for all the players and appearances they've made. Nobody in this club has made more appearances on behalf of the club than Borja Sainz. And I said to them, well, wow, that's great, because he's working really hard. And they said, well, he's very popular now. I said, well, yeah, but does he ever say no? He said, no, he always goes. So, there's great character. And so you want, if at some point he wants to move on, you do that. But January would be a little too early for us, I think.
Yeah, inevitably there's going to be interest in him and his signature at some point in the near future, Sam. But I'd imagine most of the Norwich City fan base would have heard that and sat back with a little bit of relief last night, and knowing that he's probably still going to be a Norwich player at least till the end of the season.
Yeah, I thought he was pretty affirmative on Sainz, actually, and probably more committed to that than I would have expected. We all know, the situation at Norwich, and even though there is these finances that are going to be available, we all know they are still a club that wants to sell and wants to develop players and increase the fees that they've got for him. And obviously, as someone who arrived on a free, who's out of contract in 18 months, I think a lot of people were looking at it going, ideally it would be the end of the season, but maybe Norwich would be tempted in January. But yeah, I thought Attanasio actually went pretty strong there. I think he said at one point, we don't need to sell him ever, which I think if you gave Norwich fans that choice, then they would probably go along with it. But based on, what Napa wants to do, and that is attract players in the future and show players that they can use Norwich as a bit of a stepping stone to then go on and play at the highest level, they will sell him in future. But I think it almost changes the dynamic of the season to hear that for Norwich fans, because you're looking at it now and it does feel like it's got a bit of that transitional feel back with the recent results and the injury problems and maybe the slight tempering of expectations as a result. But when you were looking at it with the Sainz situation, with the possibility for even Josh Sargent to attract interest during the transfer window, it felt like if those two went, then maybe you could even write off the season and not worry about the playoffs or about promotion hopes or what Norwich could achieve, slightly against the odds this season. But I think Attanasio, in a sense, has changed that dynamic by saying yesterday that they don't need to do that. And I think Norwich fans will now be maybe looking at it a little bit more, saying, okay, Sainz isn't just at the club until January. It isn't just, a bit of fun before then it gets even more difficult the other side of that window. And maybe that they can have ambitions for once all those players come back, that they can maybe get some decent results and try to push into that playoff picture. And it's something that they've been consistent about, that it would be a bonus to be in the promotion picture this season. It would be defying expectations, but also they're still aiming for it if they can possibly get there. And I think that underlines the fact that they are now able to, and Paddy said it actually in his question that you just heard there, they are now able to think about things in football terms rather than in purely financial terms and trying to keep the club alive. They're now able to think first about, in a sporting sense, what does selling a player do to the team? What does buying a player do to the team? And I think it does just slightly reignite any potential hopes that Norwich fans have in the short term. And that's not me saying I think they're going to get promoted or that I think playoffs are likely, but it does maybe give a bit more attention to the here and now. And I think it probably gives fans a little bit more hope going into the rest of the season to hear that.
Yeah, as Dan points out, particularly when it comes to income, and it is worth noting that fans need to maybe understand the profit sustainability rules that the club have to operate within. To not obviously end up with a sticky situation that a lot of football clubs have endured in recent times, and kind of that it's not almost a fine line that they have to balance when it comes to trying to bring in players. Paddy, in terms of Premier League and maybe the future and whether Norwich can get there, I mean, I think there was a point within the AGM. Mark Attanasio said, if we don't get to the Premier League within 5 years, I've failed. And, you kind of put that point to him when we spoke to him afterwards. And do you feel confident within the plan, the system, the structure now that this club's got in place, that is an achievable proposition for this football club trying to sustain themselves in the top flight in maybe the longer term?
Well, that's the bigger question. I mean, for me, it's the two-parter. Can this club get up? Well, of course they can, because they've proven it twice recently. And you would probably argue now that they're in a better situation in terms of the platform to enable them to do that from top to bottom, really. So, yes, I'm pretty confident that in these 5 years ahead now, subject to unforeseen events. I mean, we're talking about player there in Bullhorse Science. Players will come, players will go. You'd fear maybe, Johannes, if his star continues to rise and, interest comes from higher up the pecking order, maybe even, dare one say it, the Ben Napa situation. I'm not touting him for an exit. He's only been here a year or so. But if he starts to, within the game, start to build a reputation, then their opportunities come along. So there's always that. But I think that's where Mark, when he was talking about this 5-year cycle, he talked about, having a plan that isn't dependent on individuals. Almost an interchangeability between a coach or maybe even above that, sporting director, players below the coach, but they can still, because they've set this up in such a way that they can still progress and move forward, and just incrementally build and build and build. Of course, there's elements outside of their control, even allowing for that. There's other teams who may be trying to do things in similar ways or maybe even different ways, but with the same end goal. It's an increasingly very difficult division to get out of. There's a lot of clubs who've been in it for a long time. I mean, you look at now Narcis Belach going into Stoke. Stoke have ample financial backing, with the Coates family, and yet they have almost got themselves stuck, dare one say it, in sort of an Ipswich kind of holding pattern before they managed to pull their finger out with American ownership, it must be said. So there's no guarantees, absolutely not. There's as Mark said, I think, I don't know if we played that clip, but you can only control what they control. So there's part of this equation that, yes, you'd be confident that from everything you hear from him, everything you hear from Ben and Johannes, this club are in safe hands now. But then there's the other elements that will, ultimately decide whether they achieve it. And then, of course, to go back to your point there, Adam, having got up, can they stay up? Well, unless you can sort of emulate a Brentford or a Brighton, then the empirical evidence would suggest it's increasingly harder to stay up. But it can be done because those clubs have proven it, and with similar kind of outlooks and putting their faith in data and that informing a lot of how they operate in all the areas of the football operation. So clubs of a similar to scale to Norwich, and maybe even, without wanting to be arrogant, maybe smaller clubs than Norwich have, it would seem, managed to break the seal and not only just get promoted, but then stay there, which of course Norwich have managed, sadly, spectacularly not able to do the last 2 times. So yes, it can be done. It's difficult. Mark spoke about that last night. I think there was a slide that was put up about almost that yo-yo element and how difficult it is to sustain or to get up and then sustain yourself. But as he said, they have to be smart. And then if there's clubs who have been smart in the Premier League, they slip down and make a few bad decisions. Norwich have to be, I think his phrase was something like, we have to be ready to barge through that door. And that's very much what this boils down to, is that what they're doing now is putting everything in place to give them the best possible opportunity to A, get up, and then B, stay up. And of course, that's the fascination, really, whether you're a Norwich fan or you're not a Norwich fan, is this project, is this path they've set the club on, is it able to deliver that? Not only promotion, but consolidation. You could argue the previous project managed to achieve the first, but sadly not the latter. So, I guess at heart, it feels to me again that Norwich are trying to be progressive, trying to be doing something ahead of the curve. They're not sort of settling for the status quo. They're trying to push the envelope, and that is quite exciting because that feels fresh and that feels optimistic rather than, maybe what we had culminating with that playoff heartache / embarrassment last season, which was the sense of a head coach and a group of players who were, maybe even a club to a degree, who were at the end of the line, and that it was almost that cycle was over then. But this now feels very much new and a new episode and a new injection of ideas. And yeah, it's great. It's great to see. And you just hope, as I say, that there's enough evidence, if this is a transitional season in the final analysis, that there's enough of the good parts of what we've already seen of this project to feel, if you're a Norwich fan, no, we'll stick with it. We can see it's going to take a bit of time. Patience is required. But, I think there's a good chance that this could come together and Norwich could be back in the Premier League and, crucially, maybe stay there.
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of confidence within the comments. Even Richard saying, I feel very confident in the plan and the people, but no one is a miracle worker. We're going to sign players who kick on and those that may not work out. And Johannes Torp is going to have weaknesses too. I mean, patience is obviously going to be a key pillar in all of it. Sam, before we maybe take a little bit more of the questions from the floor here that we've got flooding through, women's team, I mean, obviously be remiss of us not to talk about that and maybe the plans for them moving forwards. I mean, Ben Napper kind of spoke about the project, and obviously they brought in Andy Cook as a full-time appointment. The players train 3 times a week, and it's clear that promotion's the aim. I know they're having a little bit of a kind of downfall in form a little bit at the moment, but hopefully that can pick back up. I mean, what did you kind of take from that sort of segment of the AGM and the comments around that?
Well, yes, it sounds like they are. Well, they almost have similar ambitions to the men's team in that they do want to get promoted. It maybe is a bit more advanced in terms of where the squad is, and they do feel that they've currently got a setup that should be in the third tier. They've got players who can get them there. Of course, they've hired a full-time head coach for the first time, and you did feel like the broader strategy is moving in a positive direction, is getting a bit more serious and a bit more ambitious, and that they are trying to put those things in place. But the problem for them, much as it is on the men's side, actually, with those injuries, is that they have slipped out of form. So they can talk as much as they like about wider strategy and how important it is to them to be in the third tier eventually. But I think right now they're fourth. Only one team gets promoted from that division. So they're already in a really difficult position this season, and of course it's a long wait to then get another opportunity next season. There is an interesting part of that equation, which is that if they go up the nest, where they obviously play most of their home games at the moment, isn't fit for purpose, doesn't fit the rules for what you need as a third tier team on the women's side, so they would need to make changes to that, and it's about whether they could complete that infrastructure with enough time to keep playing their games there, which is still the aim in the sort of mid to longer term for them. So definitely a few interesting revelations on the strategic side, but as it always is with football, so much of it is about what happens on the pitch, and you can make these broader plans and you can show signs of your intent like they have with the coach and training 3 times a week now and stepping up that professionalism. But ultimately, they haven't been able to really deliver on the pitch yet, and that's probably where the problems are for them now. So yeah, I think it's a slightly different situation because they really need that team to get up to then break the logjam so that they can put that infrastructure in place and make that progress. So while on the men's side, it's almost about the short term being less important and then the long term being the main thing so that they can then pounce in the future. I think on the women's side, it's almost the opposite in that they need the short term to go right sooner rather than later so that they can finally put in those plans for the long term and the bigger picture, because that hasn't quite gone for them just yet.
Exactly that. We'll delve into a few of the comments and questions coming through. Jason saying we're very lucky to have Mark and his team now as owners. The way he speaks, his vision is everything and more that us fans could ask for. We're, of course, be humble and won't expect miracles. Dubai Canary saying, did Dealer and Michael attend? No, they didn't. But I mean, there is definitely going to be something in the pipeline to try and sort of honour their legacy, I suppose, within the football club. It's something that Zoe Webber did speak around last night. Jonathan Hall saying, I heard Mark and the AGM follow up with Chris Gorham and Paddy. The question is, what's in it for him? I mean, Premier League football, I suppose, is the aim, Paddy, but what else is there within this football club that maybe has attracted him to Norwich?
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess you can have the romanticism of this element, or you can just have the pragmatism, or maybe a mixture of both. I mean, there's no doubt if you're an owner of a club who get into the Premier League, we've seen, the vast broadcast sums that are now being showered on those Premier League clubs, the commercial uptick, everything else, it just goes through the stratosphere in terms of revenue. And at heart, he's a very successful business person. So, that must be quite an alluring proposition. If you can, get a club and take it to the Premier League and then keep it there, then, there's some very good data and articles about why there is so many American-based owners looking to get into the English Premier League because of the relative costs of maybe associated with a Premier League club as opposed to baseball or American football, those sort of traditional US sports, of which, that's his background with the Brewers. So I'm sure that's an element. I'm sure that maybe that was the initial attraction, but, it's very clear speaking to him, listening to him at these AGMs, the fact that and I think I've heard him say it in the past that it's almost that the family have got the bug a little bit now, and that that they see this as almost something that is something for them to enjoy as a family, and obviously that Richard Resler and 1 or 2 other close associates that that it isn't maybe just that hard-headed. This is a business opportunity, and we're going to treat it like he might do with one of his asset management sort of transactions in a very cold kind of pragmatic way. It does feel there's a bit more emotion attached to this investment. It isn't just pure hard cash. It's also maybe an emotional attachment. I get the sense Mike, his son, is very invested in Norwich, and to the point where he wanted recommendations of where to go and eat out and what have you on this current trip. That went down quite well on X, didn't it? So, but yeah, I'd say for me, from where I observe it, it's probably a little bit of both. It's really the financial pragmatism of this is a very good opportunity. Norwich is a very healthy football club within the English pyramid. It has a very loyal, passionate, dedicated fan base. Stadium it owns, a stadium that could be redeveloped. A tremendous training ground now, as good as any in this country, maybe even further afield. So many good elements that would attract investment, no doubt. But I do think it's probably a little bit more than that now. I mean, as he said, it was quite interesting when I asked him about, maybe from a personal point of view, sort of taking the baton from Delia and Michael, and they felt they were sort of custodians, I think was the phrase, and he sees himself as a steward, but the one constant is the fan base, and he will never lose sight of that, and that it's about the fans, this football club, and that almost he had to stop before he thought, do I want this, because of the responsibility that comes with it, because of that investment from people who, have green and yellow in their blood, basically. So the fact he gets that and he understands it, even though he's coming from a non-soccer background, if I can just use that term once, given the American element, then I think that tells me that it's a little bit more than just a pure transactional arrangement for him and his family. This is now something they're invested in on both levels. And as I say, if it Norwich get to the Premier League, then it's a win-win on both measures, isn't it?
I think the Brewers point is probably an important example on that one as well, because yes, there are obviously the financial elements. As Paddy referenced, it is a good investment if you can get a club when they're on the way down to the Championship and then get them promoted to the Premier League, and they're worth a lot more. But for me, the evidence that it's not just about making a quick buck and selling them as soon as they get back to the Premier League is that he's been at the Brewers, I think, for more than 20 years now. So given that's also a sporting entity and something that's big in the community and things like that, I think that's positive evidence for Norwich fans who maybe want to be assured a little bit more that it isn't just about, a rapid turnaround and venture capitalism and trying to, make his money back and make a profit as quickly as possible. I think he's shown previously that he wants that sort of longer term involvement, and I thought it was actually interesting that he spoke about maybe the succession plan with his son Mike, and the fact that he maybe wouldn't want to be doing what he's doing now at the age that Delia and Michael have got to, but he did talk about that succession plan, and that probably tells you that he's thinking about the long term rather than just making money quickly.
Yeah, we'll be live for another 5 or 10 minutes. So any late comments, questions, of course, get them down below. Mark saying the club literally has a clean sheet. It's very exciting. The new ownership and management need to be given time. So far this season, though, so many fans appear to have forgotten that that's the case. There's a few questions around kind of the striker situation maybe and value for money in January. We actually had a lot of this debate on the recent Pinkham podcast. There's also one around Ashley Barnes and maybe that striker position. Who plays that when he comes back? Again, I'll probably point you towards the latest podcast in terms of that and maybe that situation, because we sort of had more of a wider debate about who could potentially play for the middle. I think there was also a piece on our channel's written form as well during the week as to kind of that situation. Alex saying thoughts on the Brad Hill situation. Started most of pre-season games, played well, but as soon as the season started, he's not had a proper chance. And I mean, that probably links a little bit to Jonathan's point here. January seems a long way off, given the sort of poor performances of late. We can't get bogged down in the wrong end of the table. Could any of the 23 step up? I mean, a little bit away from the AGM, but Paddy, I mean, your sort of response to kind of the youth there that could potentially come in and maybe fill some gaps. I mean, the fact that they've not really been trusted maybe in recent games maybe suggests they're not quite ready at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And of course, if we're talking youth in that sort of sense, it's kind of the players who've been in and around the 23s, but youth is also a Mankwa Forsen. It's maybe even Schwartau to a slightly lesser degree, because he's had a bit more exposure now with no Nunes, no McLean. So there's almost a strata of younger player above that 23s group who aren't in the 11 when all those senior players come back. So I think there is going to be probably limited opportunities for that 23s cohort over the second part of this season. Really, the one who's made the breakthrough is Gabe Forsyth in a big way, and that just maybe underlines that Johannes feels there aren't too many others in the Gabe Forsyth category in the here and now, and that's what a lot of the work that's going to be going on now with Dean Rastrick coming in as the new head of the academy, and obviously Glenn Riddisome is that kind of link, isn't he, between the first team and the academy, and even below it, 21s, the 18s and all the other lower age groups. But that takes time to produce those type of players. So I don't see too many coming in. And just to go full circle, the first part about Brad Hills, I think it's got to be a loan now, isn't it, for him in January? I know he's coming back from a bit of an issue with his back, so he'll need to get fully fit in terms of physically. But he's just had no game time whatsoever. I mean, Grant Hanley's kicking his heels, really, and let's be honest, he's probably behind him in the pecking order. So if Duffy and Cordoba stay fit, then it's very hard to see Brad Hills getting any football. I mean, Tompkinson and Warner look to have fallen completely by the wayside, so I could see those two, if not going out on loan, maybe going out permanently in January, because it doesn't look like they're going to feature in Johannes's plans. Brad Hills certainly does, new contract and all that to boot earlier this season, but you're in that balance now where, to go back to the Adamida situation from years gone by, is it to his detriment to keep him around the group for a season or two or three or longer in Adam's case, when he's not playing really a lot of minutes? So for me, I think they'll look at that. And he had such a good time with Accrington last season, where he played a lot of minutes and he really came on. Do you look at League One, maybe even lower end Championship, and try and get him some football in January? Because I don't think it's going to, purely in a development cycle, do Brad Hills any favours to have another 6 months like he's had this 6 months, which is not a lot of football, really.
Exactly. Sam Dan Mayhew saying, I haven't read or watched all the content from the AGM yet, but did the new leadership team side talk about the football governance bill, which yesterday got second reading in the House of Lords?
No, I don't think it got reference from memory, which I suppose, was a question you might have thought would be asked, but it feels like things are still a little bit of a way away from actually affecting football clubs. So I suppose that's why it's maybe not on people's minds just yet, but I'm sure it's something that obviously that panel and that board of directors will be considering. But to be honest, it was quite a lot less of the big picture stuff last night. And as we referenced a little bit earlier, it was more about, experience at Carrow Road and maybe some more individual concerns, which of course shareholders have every right to ask about. But I think given there's so much else in terms of interviews and press conferences and things where people talk about the football and hear about the football from those sorts of personalities, I think it was an evening where people maybe wanted to raise more minor issues that have affected them than some of the bigger ones like that one, which definitely is an interesting topic and probably is something that those people should be asked about fairly soon. But it feels like it's still on its way out of the periphery and into full vision for fans, and that's probably why it didn't actually come up last night.
Yeah, a few more positive comments here. Richard saying, hope Mark Attanasio's money can help us avoid situations like the one we face now. Good top-end talent, but a thin squad. Overall, Simon, Universe of Music, saying, really just looking forward to getting into the Premier League and getting brilliant players to play for Norwich in the future and move forward. High praise for you, Paddy from Andrew. Paddy says it's going to happen. I'm assuming referencing getting to the Premier League. This guy knows his onion.
My natural inclination is to think that's a wind-up rather than praise, but there you go. Maybe that's the world we live in. Maybe, but thank you if it is positive. Thank you.
Kevin saying, we do have good players, but I hate international breaks now. Unlike years ago, we have so many good international players who keep going away, and we have worries of injuries, whereas other clubs don't. I mean, thankfully, probably this time around, they have a few less internationals, given a few have sort of pulled out, and some haven't obviously been available due to injury generally for Norwich. So maybe a little bit more of a less concern in terms of this window. But of course, there's still lots of players out there. Svartau scoring yesterday for Denmark's youth team, so that would have done him the world of good in terms of his confidence. Boys, I don't think that's any more comments or questions there for us. I mean, any other business that I've missed out that you want to bring up in kind of the last minutes or so of this broadcast?
Well, I was just thinking, do we want to tease? There might be an announcement tomorrow, Maybe I'll put that back in your court. And then the other thing was pertinent because we've spent a lot of this discussing the future and Mark Attanasio and Norfolk Holdings, but obviously there's a past, and that's Delia and Michael, and we're just going to show them a bit of love over this weekend with some nice, well, we think nice content, and in particular some nice video messages from one or two people. Maybe we can just throw a few names out there who we've managed to harvest, and we'll push all that out over the weekend. Back to you, Al.
Yeah, there's a few nice names. A certain manager that brought 2 promotions relatively recently, I'd say, to Norwich City, and not just a 1-minute video clip like the majority of the rest. Classic Daniel Farker. I think it's about 8 minutes long. So there's some really nice stories in there, which I'm sure plenty of Norwich fans are going to be excited to hear about. Maybe dinner at Delia's house and breakfast he had at Delia's house, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's well worth listening to. There's a few other sort of, I suppose, players from that era, Christoph Zimmermann, Mario Vrancic. Then you kind of go further back at another promotion winner in terms of manager in Nigel Worthington. Nice to hear from him again. There's plenty of others in terms of Norwich City, maybe royalty in terms of fans. You go kind of Stephen Fry, who, of course, has done stuff previously on this channel. He sort of references a few nice bits. A striker from maybe 2004, Leo McKenzie. I won't give too many more away, but there's a few kind of good names in there that I think you'll all enjoy, speaking around Delia and Michael, and maybe those personal stories and tributes to those two. And then, as Paddy mentioned, we've got an exciting sponsorship with a certain local bus company coming your way tomorrow. It's going to sponsor the podcast. I think it's going to be exciting moving forwards. Plenty of sort of exciting content with those guys that we've got lined up, which of course will bring to you on these channels. So if you're not already a subscriber to the Pinken YouTube channel, then we're closing in on 10K. So we'd obviously appreciate if you could click that subscribe button down below and like all our content as per usual. And of course, we've got all the usual stuff over on the app as well, which you can check out for pretty reasonable price. We feel there's also maybe an offer coming fairly short order as well towards that. So maybe that's one worth checking out, particularly with Christmas sort of getting closer. As I look down at the date, I think there's plenty of Norwich fans out there that maybe come Christmas you're struggling to know what to buy them. I think a Pinken Plus subscription is always a good option. So plenty of good stuff on there as well. And of course, as we mentioned, stuff coming your way over this weekend across our channels as well, which of course, we hope you will consume and enjoy. So with that, we're going to sign off. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday, of course. Enjoy your weekend, whatever you're getting up to. An international weekend always feels a little bit weird. No Norwich City action, but of course, we'll all be at the Hawthorns in just over a week's time, where hopefully Norwich City might have a few players back, the likes of Angus Gunn, which of course will give us a little bit more confidence, maybe making that trip against a side that's also a little bit out of form. So with that, we'll see you at the other side. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy your weekend.